When it comes to buying a piece of raw land, there are countless mistakes that people make. The good news is they can be avoided. It doesn't matter if it's waterfront property like this one or just a bunch of land out in the country. There's things that you gotta do. You gotta make sure that you do your due diligence. You hear me say that all the time. You gotta make sure that you do your homework. So the first thing you'll wanna do when you find a piece of land that you really like, of course, make an offer. But once the offer is accepted, the first thing you need to do is get a copy of the deed restrictions and covenants. Now look, buying a piece of land is totally different than buying a house. When you buy a house, you're gonna have your inspections and do your inspections, but land, it's the same way. So what I mean by that is you want to do an inspection on the actual land itself. You'll want to make sure there's nothing on that piece of property that could hinder the value after you purchase it. Now look, if it's in a neighborhood, you need to get your restrictions and covenants and all of that. If it's on the water and you want to put a boat dock, you better make sure that you can actually put a boat dock. You see, your property will go down into the water. But unfortunately, you've got to get permission from the United States Department of Corps of Engineers to put anything in that water. And look, you do this through your inspection period. So you have an inspection period just like you're buying a house, but you'll typically have 10 to 14 days of which you can get all of this information. And the number one thing you need to do is get a copy of the restrictions and the covenants, because you got to know what you can and can't do on that property before you even spend any more money and any more time on it. Now look, here's a huge mistake that people make when they buy land. They don't realize that they have that time frame that they can do an inspection, they can do their research on the property. What happens is they don't do their research until maybe a week or two before closing. Now at that point, it's too late. And here's what I mean by that. You buy a piece of land, you want to do your research. You want to make sure that there's no restrictive covenants. You got to know setbacks. If you're going to build a house, can you put temporary housing on the property? You don't want to wait till the last minute. You don't want to wait till a week before closing, because that's how you lose your deposit. But it's way more expensive than that if you don't buy that property. You see, if you decide to not buy a property after your inspection time frame that you've given in the contract, you can be sued for specific performance to the contract. Now listen, I'm not trying to scare you, but you can be sued up to 10% of the purchase price of the property. So if it's a $200,000 piece of land, you can be sued for $20,000. Now, if you don't think a frustrated property owner won't sue you, then think again. I've had it happen to clients of mine where they literally didn't do all of the work that we advised them to do, and they decided to not go through with the purchase of the property. Well, quite simply, the seller hired an attorney and took them to court. And yes, you guessed it, they went to court, they lost, cost them money, and the seller was awarded close to $30,000. Don't let that happen. Now look, the best way to avoid that from happening is quite simple. Get with a good real estate agent. A vetted real estate agent who has the experience will not cost you any money out of pocket, and they're working for you in your best interest. Why it doesn't cost you anything out of pocket is simple. So here's how it works. When a property is listed for sale, it gets placed in what they call the multiple listing service. The multiple listing service is a real estate agent database that real estate appraisers and real estate agents use. Now, they use that database to determine values of properties, and they also use that database to market properties for sale. So it's pretty simple. The homeowner pays the listing company to sell their property. The listing company pays a real estate brokerage to bring a buyer for their property. So it doesn't cost you any money out of pocket to have somebody in your corner representing you, working for you. And listen, it's done this way all over the world. And it doesn't matter if you're buying land, commercial property, investment property. It's important to have a good real estate agent. Now, I don't care who you use. We have agents all around the country, all around the world, Canada, you name it. And that's why we always say, if you need help, you need assistance, you can reach out to us. You can go to contactwayne.com. I'll put it right here on the screen. That's a simple, free little website. You can put in your information. We immediately get an email. We reach out to you and match you with the agent that best fits exactly what you're looking for. Now, another huge mistake that we see people make is not doing their work to find out what's going in next to you. If there's vacant property around you, chances are it's going to be something someday. Now look, when it comes to a lot of things, you want them. You want big box stores, grocery stores, gas stations. That's going to increase your property value every single time, simply because people like to be close to amenities. They just want to be left alone. Now, it's not enough to just do your survey, do your research, and of course always talk to neighbors around you, but you want to make sure that the property's not in a crazy flood zone. There's different flood zones. There's A, B, C, there's X. You want to make sure your property that you buy is in a flood zone. It's not going to flood often. Now look, it's okay to buy a property that's in a flood zone. Believe it or not, there's different flood zones, as I mentioned, but you also want to make sure that it's not in a crazy high flood zone where it's going to cost you $7,000 or $10,000 a year just for flood insurance. So depending on where you live, you could be in a flood zone, but flood insurance is not required. You see, if you have B, C, or X flood zones, you don't have to have flood insurance on your property. It's not required by a mortgage lender. Now, don't get me wrong, some states are different. The state of Florida, for example, they're mandating that every single homeowner in the state of Florida have a flood insurance policy on their property, period. Now, with B and C flood zone, it's not required by a mortgage lender to have it. But if you're in flood zone A, you're right here on the water, you're going to have flood insurance. And even if you don't have to have it, you want to get it. Now, the only real way to know what your flood insurance is going to cost, you got to have a survey and you got to have a flood elevation certificate. The flood elevation certificate will show you where your property sits in reference to sea level. So what can be an absolute train wreck is if you don't get a quote for insurance based on the size of the house or the type of the house, the mobile home that you're going to put on the property. Because if you don't, and then you put something on the property and you try to get a home loan, a mortgage on that property, you may not even be able to get a mortgage on the property that you're just building. Or worst case scenario, your flood insurance is so expensive that you can't even qualify for the house. And look, doing this work doesn't take a whole lot of time, but you want to make sure you do this work before you close on any piece of property, because the last thing you want to do is wait to the very last minute and find that you can't even buy the house that you're looking to put on the property. You can't even get a mortgage for the home that you literally just built. Now, when you buy a property, oftentimes the land has been surveyed, but don't get me wrong, I've sold many properties, contracted many properties, and there's no pins on the corners, there's no meets and bounds, there's never been a survey on the property. So the last thing you'll want to do is close on a piece of property and have somebody come knocking on your door or hunting you down and basically saying, hey, I own a portion of that property. You never want to close on a home and all of a sudden you find out that someone has a right-of-way going across your property to access their property. So have you ever heard of the term being landlocked? Yeah, believe it or not, there's land out there all around the country that is locked in. In other words, there's no way to access it without crossing someone else's property. And the only way to cross their property legally is to get a servitude. Now, servitudes are easy to do. It's a 2-page document. It can be written up by any attorney. However, you got to get permission from the people that own the property that you need to cross to get to your property. And look, usually this is not an issue. We just closed a transaction on a piece of property and the seller said that's quite all right. The buyer said that's quite all right. And a neighboring property owner said, I'll be glad to sign a servitude to grant you permission to cross 20% of my property to access your property. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. See, some people aren't as nice, some people aren't as cordial, some people aren't as friendly. My grandmother always said you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Some people just don't know that. Now, you do a survey, you know where your meets and bounds and the size of the property. The survey is going to see and show you if there's any servitude on the property granting someone access across your property, or you have to have access granted on the property that you're buying. But look, that $2,000, it's going to give you, hey, how's it going? That $2,000 is going to give you peace of mind knowing that no one is encroaching upon your property. See, even though you have a survey on the property, you definitely want to walk the property, because you just don't know if someone else's fence or garage or shed or chicken, hen, house, whatever is on your property. Now, you're doing all this work, and I know it's work. It's work. But here's the deal. If you find that there's a servitude or encroachments or anything like that, you can make the decision not to buy the property and basically get your money back. Or if you still wish to purchase the property, at that point, it's the responsibility of the seller. The person that you're buying the property from can do the work to make sure the servitude, the easement, and everything is cleared away. So once you take possession of it, no worries. And this is why it's important to go trekking through the woods, because you never know on the backside of your property it's going to adjoin a cemetery. Now, there's nothing wrong with the cemetery. Believe it or not, there's some of the most quiet, peaceful places to be neighbors too. But here's a little FYI reminder, if you will, and I've just learned this from my own personal mistake. When you go to walk across a bunch of land and property like that, I don't care what time of year it is, you gotta get you some good bug spray. And don't walk that property, do not walk that property in shorts. Don't make it any easier for the bugs to get you with the good Lord split you. Wear some pants, some high socks, shoes, boots, walk around that property, make sure you're sprayed down with bug spray. You'll thank me later. Oh, what he was afraid of. So look, when you're buying a piece of land, you can't be afraid to get low with the ground. You're gonna look for spots that may be holding water, because spots that hold water never turn out good. But don't get me wrong, there's certain water, like the water you gotta drink or take a bath with, that's the water you want on the property. But it's not the end of the world. You can always dig a well. So look, water can be a good thing. You gotta drink it, you gotta take a bath with it, and it's certainly beautiful to look at, especially if it's clear blue water. But it's also really important to know that if you're close proximity to fire hydrants and fire halls and police departments, your insurance is actually lower. Not just your homeowners, but your auto insurance. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that people make after they buy the land, they have the land, they own the land, is quite simply not paying the taxes. And look, it's not that they don't want to pay the taxes or they don't have the money to pay the taxes. It's quite simply, if you didn't get anything in the mail, you just forget to pay it. Now, you would think paying your taxes, how hard can that be? And on a vacant piece of land, your taxes are typically not that expensive. But unfortunately, people just simply forget about it. Now, I've had this happen, true story, to clients, where they buy property from me, they call me 2 years later, and they say, Wayne, we forgot to pay the property taxes. And look, if you don't pay, you don't stay. They take your land. The city, the county, they take your land, and they take your land and sell it. So quite simply what happens is they sell your property. They sell your property to the highest bidder. And oftentimes that's pennies on the dollar or the value of the land. This means that they sell the property and you no longer own it. They own the property, but there is a way to save it. You see, when you own a piece of property and you buy a piece of property at a tax sale, you lose your house at a tax sale. There's what they call a right of redemption. You get to actually redeem your property. So buying property knowing you're gonna live there is an emotional decision, very much so. Where are your kids gonna go to school? Where are you gonna grocery shop? How bad's the traffic? What's the crime? Just do all of that and know that whenever you buy that property, it's gonna be yours for a while.